Down here in Texas, a rodeo's our national pastime. There's bronc bustin', or as you see, rider bustin', and one of the most exciting events is Brahma bull riding, which certainly has its ups and downs. And for the really brave and courageous, there's steer wrestling or bulldogging, where the cowboy is supposed to throw the bull. And in calf roping, the cowboy has to beat the clock and overcome the resistance of the calf. Now, a rodeo is full of excitement, and if you've never seen one, I'd recommend going to one. I'm sure you'll like it. And so, what's a rodeo got to do with selling Pontiacs? Well, in a rodeo, the object of all the events is to sell the critters on doing what you want them to do. And so it is with our business, selling. And like a rodeo contestant, it's sometimes necessary for us to overcome some pretty strong objections, which brings us to the subject of today's concepts meeting: closing and overcoming objections. My granddaddy started our business about 85 years ago. Of course, he wasn't selling Pontiacs, but he was selling transportation. And even though a lot has changed over the years, we still use about the same sales approach as he did. Granddaddy knew that he had to begin closing when he first met his prospect, just as we still do. And he also knew that he had to have the trust and confidence of the prospect, and that surely hadn't changed. And when Granddaddy qualified his prospect, he was thinking all the time, because he wanted to be sure that he presented and demonstrated exactly the right features and benefits that would appeal to the prospect's interests, which is just as important today as it was then. Of course, the appraisal in those days was apt to be a little different from today, but still he kept right on. And he did all of these things every time. And because he did, he closed a lot of deals. And even today, if we've handled our prospects right during our sales approach, we generally close the deal and make the sale. Of course, Granddaddy had his share of reluctant prospects who balked a little when it came time to making the buying decision, and we get our share of those even now. But he was a pretty determined old cuss, and he had several different closing techniques that he used to help him. First thing he did was to assume his prospect was going to buy, and everything he did or said convinced the prospect that he was expected to buy. He referred to the horse as the prospect's new horse, to the wagon as the prospect's new wagon, and if there was an objection to the price, he'd tell the prospect that he was giving him the very best deal, and that he'd back this up by restating all the advantages of trading at Pecos Pete's Horse and Pony Parlor. And you know, this is still my favorite close, talking about his new car, by selling our product and our dealership. It works too. Just try it. Granddaddy also used the inducement close. He'd offer something special the prospect couldn't get at another stable, such as, an extra bridle or a free rub down for the horse. And many times he'd bet the prospect $1 that he wouldn't trade, and he'd put his money right on the table. Oh, he lost a lot of bets, but on the other hand, he made a lot of sales. Another technique he used was the physical action close. While he and the prospect were discussing the deal, he'd tell the stable hand to transfer the prospect's saddlebag to the new horse, or to get the new wagon hitched up for delivery. If the prospect didn't object, then he knew he'd closed the deal. I do this same thing by calling the service manager and asking him to transfer the prospect's personal gear to the new car, or asking him to prepare the new car for delivery within a few hours. Now, if the prospect was riding an old nag, Granddaddy would use the narrative close. He'd tell the story about the parson who was thinking about trading his old gray mare. It seems the parson thought that the trading price was just a little high and decided to make just one more trip around his circuit. Well, as luck would have it, about 2 days later the old horse went lame, and the parson had to walk about 60 miles in the blazing hot sun. It cost that parson a lot more to get a new horse when he got back, because his trade-in was worn completely out and wasn't worth a plugged nickel. This story is mighty convincing when your prospect is undecided about buying, especially if he has a high-mileage trade-in. In fact, I used this same story just the other day. Another closing technique is to get the prospect to make a minor decision. Granddaddy would ask the prospect if he wanted the bill of sale made out to just the prospect or to include the wife's name. And with all the horse thieves in those days, this bill of sale was mighty important. Or he'd ask him if he wanted his buckboard fitted out with the regular seat or with the new leaf spring seat, which would make it more comfortable for his wife. Today, I sell our custom interiors in just about the same way. Now, once the prospect agreed that he did want the new seat, then he was on his way to buying the wagon. Several small decisions like this will help make the final decision just another small one. Another one of Granddaddy's favorite techniques was to relate the need to purchase to some impending event. For example, in the winter, he'd remind his prospect that spring would soon be here and that with all the trips that would be made hauling supplies during roundup, a new wagon and team would lessen the possibility of any delays due to equipment failure. And, of course, if there was a wedding coming up in the family or perhaps a new son due before long, he'd sell the advantage of getting a new buggy for that special event. The last technique he used is the ask for the business close. It's the most simple and yet the least used. He'd come right out and say, "Now look, this is a fair deal. You need this new wagon. The price is fair, so let's trade right now." You know, it's surprising how many competitive salesmen forget to ask for the business. It's so basic that they overlook the effectiveness of this technique. Remember, business goes where it's invited and it stays where it's appreciated. This was true even back then. And inviting a fellow to buy from you is often the best closing approach. As I've said, these same closing techniques still work. And I find that when I use them, my prospects have fewer objections at the time of close. However, when I hear an objection, I handle it just like old Granddaddy. If it's a minor objection or an unfavorable comment, then overlook it for the time being. Many times it'll just take care of itself. Of course, though, if it's a real strong objection, it must be handled. And here's a good way to handle it. It's called the feel, felt, found method. And Granddaddy would say something like, "Well, now, Tex, I know how you feel. Others have felt that way, too. However, I've found that the horn on the Western-style saddle makes a good handhold in an emergency." This technique relieves the emotional tension of the prospect, and he gets into the buying mood when he feels he has understanding. Remember, you must overcome a prospect's emotional reaction before you can overcome his logical objections, and the feel, felt, found method is the best way to handle emotion. After overcoming an objection, he'd get the prospect relaxed, maybe get him laughing, and then he'd continue his close. On the other hand, an objection is often nothing more than a request for some additional information. So the thing to do is to supply the information and then continue closing. However, when he was unable to overcome a specific objection, such as price, he'd often switch the prospect to a less expensive rig, which is more in line with what the prospect wanted to pay. Sometimes he sold the less expensive model, and other times the prospect decided that the extra features of the higher-priced model were, after all, worth the extra cost. I presented 3 different Catalinas to a fella just last week, and he ended up buying the more expensive one. Overcoming an objection is just plain old horse sense. Either you explain away the objection, or you just acknowledge that what your prospect says is true, but in your opinion, all of the advantages certainly overshadow that one small disadvantage. That old man said time and again that our job was to help the prospect buy, and that when the prospect realized that we were on his side, then the job of buying became easier and more pleasant for him. And this is certainly true of today's prospect. Closing is simply a matter of understanding the prospect's needs and desires and his ability to pay. And when you've qualified a prospect, you can sell to his needs and desires, and you can sell him a Pontiac he can afford and will be happy with. The secret to closing and overcoming objections is treating the prospect like he wants to be treated, listening to his objections, and offering him a reason to buy from you. In the next concepts meeting, we're going to move on out to Pacific Pontiac to talk about what happens after the sale. Delivery and owner follow-up. Two important steps that can assure you of good repeat business for years to come. See you, partner.